Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's Goat Roadshow webinar on understanding and reducing kid loss. My name is Vanessa, and before we start, we'll just go through a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the webinar, please we ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your page. We will endeavour to answer any of the questions during the sessions, but we will have a Q&A session with our panellists at the conclusion of the speakers. We will start off with Dr. Gordon Refshawji. Gordon has worked as a research scientist with New South Wales DPI for 15 years. His work focuses on animal production, particularly the reproduction of sheep and goats. This also involves studies of nutrition, management, thermal environment and technologies, and in the past, meat science, wool production and genetics. Fun fact, in 2020, his working dog was the star in a short film called Dust Cloud. We're pleased to have Gordon with us today to share some of his insights. So thank you, Gordon.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'd like to start by welcoming everybody to the webinar and the recording, and also to thank Mel Smith and Vanessa from MLA and Bridget from Ag Communicators for inviting me to speak and supporting me in this presentation. I'm going to jump to my take-home messages, so the bulk of my presentation is going to be based in the literature and reflecting on some of the work that I've undertaken as a part of the Kid Loss Project, which was work that we did in 2019. The take-home messages that I'll lead you to with the background information will be delivered really by James Boland and Craig Stewart. No pressure for you, gentlemen, but this is how we'll shape the webinar. So I'll get into it. So the first presentation that I've got starts with a quote. Now there's some embellishment I think in around this quote, but it's a great example of the potential and the power of the goat. So I was doing an infrastructure tour in earlier this year, and we were north of Ivanhoe, and a producer there said that 8 months previous they'd put 1,000 does and 1,000 billies in this paddock. And 8 months later, they took 6,000 animals out of there. And when I think about that, it reflects on the need to manage an animal, even in a lowly managed environment. You need to keep your eye on the ball. These animals can be like gremlins. If you've watched the movie Gremlins, I think Gizmo, was a little alien toy, and you spill a bit of water on it, and all of a sudden these little blisters pop on the animal, and there's gremlins all over the place. Now, I'm not saying the goat is a gremlin, but when you add water and the seasonal conditions are right, then you can have kids popping up all over the place. And I think that's a great metaphor for what the animal can do. A bit of background around the reproduction of the goat is that it's a bit like a cow and a bit like a pig and a bit like a sheep. Its estrous cycle's similar to a cow, it being 3 weeks. The pregnancy, like a pig, is maintained primarily by the corpora lutea. That is the former follicle on the ovary, produces the egg or the eggs. As it degrades, it maintains progesterone, and that maintains the pregnancy. The gestation length is like a sheep, so it's 5 months. Now, a really important thing about the goat is that its reproduction is relatively sensitive to nutrition. So when nutrition, high quality nutrients are available to the animal, and the seasonal conditions are right, particularly time of the year and age, then the animal will be reproductive, and quite sensitively so. When nutrition is limiting and we start to get stresses into the system, then reproduction's downregulated. It depresses, and so it's sensitive to nutrition. It's an important thing to think about. A lot of people coming into goats for the first time have the sense that the animal will perform well on the stuff that nothing else is performing well on. And I don't think it's really right to say that the animal will perform well on cardboard. It has a nutritional requirement, and it's quite important. The way it finds its nutrition is different, to the sheep and the cow, and they are very competent animals in the rangeland environment with a diverse browse base. But if you just put them on cardboard, you're not going to get a great result. Puberty is defined as the time of the first ovulation. So a young animal can stand in heat and display sexual behaviour, but if it isn't ovulating, it's not going to get pregnant. So puberty is defined as the time of ovulation, which can happen anywhere between 6 and 9 months of age, and it's sensitive to live weight, and those differences can be influenced by the breeds. So the boar cross needs to be heavier, the rangeland animal can be lighter at the time of puberty. The animals are fecund, which means when they have kids, there's usually more than one kid at foot, so that's fecundity, and the average rates are quite high when compared to other domesticated species like the sheep. Again, there's some breed variation between these averages in the literature, but by and large, across all the studies, the animals are fecund. If they get pregnant, they're oftentimes mostly having twins. Reproductive success is a combination of a number of other factors such as age, which I've discussed a little bit, live weight, nutrition, season of birth, season of the year, and the breed. And they're multifactorial and they can interact. When we think about kid loss, we have to start with that we have a pregnancy, and then we get to marking. And somewhere between those 2 points, we're starting to lose embryos, fetuses, and kids. And that's called reproductive wastage, and there's many sources of reproductive wastages, and there's times of the year or the pregnancy when that will happen. And the first of the earliest of those is in the fetus. And so the literature will tell us that there are a number of factors that can affect the rate of fetal mortality, and they're generally nutritionally sensitive. So an animal that's held at maintenance, so it's not losing weight, not gaining weight, fetal mortality can be quite low at around that 2%. And these are in, I think, Angora cross animals. When animals are losing weight, and only small amounts of weight, relatively small amounts of weight, 6% weight loss during mid-pregnancy, fetal mortality rate can be quite high at 17%. Another way to look at that, and this work's done in dairy goats, if the animals are held in good body condition, so body condition scores a range of 1 to 5, it really reflects how much muscle and fat tissue occupies the loin space on the small of the back of the animal. So you might expect, for those online viewing later, you won't see this, but you have the loin of the animal looking like that. And so there's not a lot of muscle tissue in a very lean animal. As they get fatter, it becomes a filled eye muscle space. So an animal that's got adequate nutrition is around 3 on a 1 to 5 scale. And when they're held at that condition score, fetal mortality is relatively low. When the animals are losing weight and losing condition down to condition score 2, which is a lean animal where you can quite easily feel the bones, but they're not emaciated, we have an increase of fetal mortality to about 20%. There's also a nutritional stress. So when we think that the pregnancy is maintained by progesterone produced from the corpora lutea, which is a very small little organ on the body, it is going to be sensitive to stress, particularly stress hormones. And so there's an observation in the literature that says around day 90 to 120 days, in a nearly 150-day gestation, so at the mid-pregnancy to late pregnancy stage, a nutritional stress can stimulate abortions. So, and those losses can be relatively high. Age is also an important part explaining fetal mortality, and we see this in sheep as well. So first parity, which can be a doe kid to have its first kids at about 1 year of age, or those up to 2 years of age, we're classifying as maidens in this story. And so first parity maidens are at a much higher risk of fetal mortality, and so too are the most oldest does. But in the middle, those rates are relatively low, and we see the same sort of thing in sheep. Other factors that really influence perinatal mortality, the losses of kids around the time of birth, are going to also include location and the management system. So in particular, high rainfall zone where feed is generally more abundant, while there can be more worms, which can have a problem also. the feed base is generally more stable, and when compared to the pastoral zone, where it can be much more seasonal and variable. So locations has an influence on the rates of mortality. We can expect more losses in a pastoral zone than we do in the high rainfall zone, which is work taken from a recent survey. Litter size, so that refers to how many kids are being born, whether there's 1, 2, 3 or more kids being born, also has an important effect on the chances of survival. Those rates come from a number of different studies in global literature, and they're relatively low compared to the sheep when it comes to twins, but when it comes to triplets, it can really blow out. And we see the same sort of thing in sheep, much higher mortality rates as the number of kids or lambs that are being born increases. Nutrition is also an important factor. So animals held at maintenance through pregnancy and up to the time of kidding have relatively low loss rates when compared to animals that are at sub-maintenance, which means they're going to be losing condition and having smaller weight kids. The mortality rates can really elevate. That work's been done. That work was done at the Condobolin Research Station in the 1980s. And breed also has a bit of a role in here as well. So the sorts of things that can contribute to the rates of mortality will be location, litter size, nutrition, breed, and some other animal-based factors. I think, did I have another slide in there? I'm not too sure if I did. I'll just go back and forth. Right. If we think about cause of death, there's only a handful of studies here that have collected neonatal kids at the time of birth and investigated the reason for their losses. And one of those was done at Temora Research Station in New South Wales DPI's holding back in the day. And the primary cause of death there was starvation, mismother, and exposure. So these are young kids that are either succumbing to the cold because they haven't fed, or their does have walked away from them, usually because of a failure of an interaction between the doe and the kid. The kid doesn't suckle milk, it's not going to bond, and it will ultimately starve unless it's extremely cold, in which case it'll fail to the weather first. Dystocia is an important factor. So dystocia is difficult birth, and in that study it was an important component. Primary predation is highly seasonal and variable according to your environment, and in this study relatively low. And death in utero, which is related to kids that are born dead and not developed in the last weeks or even month or so before birth, or can be abortions, and that's also relatively low in that particular study. Some other critical factors that affect cause of death, and this is very similar to many species that we work with in production systems. So birth weight usually has a U-shaped relationship with mortality. Very lightweight kids tend to have an elevated mortality. As birth weight really gets quite high, you start to see an increase again. There's not a lot of consistent literature around high birth weight leading to high rates of mortality in goats. So a lot of the focus has been on malnourished kids that are less than 2.5 kilograms, where mortality rate starts to really climb significantly. Wind chill index is also important. The goat is an animal that's quite adapted to hot weather, which means it's going to be vulnerable to cold weather. So the wind chill index is a calculation of wind speed, rainfall, and temperature over a 24-hour period. It's measured as it's measured as the rate of energy lost to the system or out of the system, or a measure of the energy the animal needs to eat ultimately in a space over time. In the sheep, the wind chill index that is at a level of 1100 will significantly increase mortality. And generally in lambs, you don't get great elevations of mortality until you reach about 1100. But in goats, this one particular study showed that 62% of all the losses occurred when the wind chill index was at 950. And there was a clear elevation at 1000. So it doesn't have to be quite as cold to kill a kid than it does to be to kill a lamb. So there's a subtle difference there. There's not a lot of literature around infectious causes leading to abortions in the literature, and Susan Robertson, as a part of our Kid Loss project, wrote the literature review and covered cause of death and couldn't find a great amount of literature on infection. We, as a part of that 2019 study, we did some work looking at laboratory submissions in South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales, and classified most of those causes into a number of different areas. And so for perinatal diseases or losses of kids before or around the time of birth, it was mostly nutritional causes were the most common causes of death. And those factors associated with abortion and stillbirth were also generally nutritional in origin, but also chlamydia popped up as a key disease. And I saw in some of the registrations there were questions around Q fever, and I'm quite happy to answer some questions on that. It might be a disease that tends to fly under the radar a little bit as a disease, but it doesn't feature strongly in the disease submissions or in the literature. So it's not a big problem. The bigger problems are things like birth weights, time of the year, age of the animal, of the female giving birth. So in our work that we did in 2019, which I should remind you was the peak of a 3-year drought, it was a very difficult year for the goat producers. We pregnancy scanned just over 9,000 does, which of mixed age, and about 2,000 of those were classified as maidens. Now I'm just sharpening my pencil in on maidens here because this is actually quite important and it stood out in the study. And it showed that generally the maidens had lower pregnancy rates and lower kid survival rates, which means their weaning rates weren't terribly good. It was in a drought. I've got a little bit of data on this. So we'll start with a summary of the pregnancy scanning results. With this, I'm moving a bit away from kid loss, but I'm focusing still on reproductive wastage. So the fertility varied generally between rangelands and the high rainfall zones of north and south, which was slightly different. Because it was a difficult year, the pregnancy rates are much lower than we'd normally expect. I'd expect a 90% plus, but you can see in the range that there was a large range from 45 to 97%. When we look at kid survival, there was also a variation according to the regions, which flipped around the other way from what the literature might suggest, where the rangelands in the literature has a lower survival rate and the high rainfall zones have a higher. In this circumstance, in our particular study, it was the other way around, and on average 65% rate. And so putting the two together, you have a 77% marking rate from does scanned, which is pretty low and difficult for a difficult year. There was enormous variation, and a lot of the background behind the variation related to seasonal conditions where the study was being undertaken. When we drilled a little deeper into how the performances were going within particular farms, where farmers were managing adults and maidens separately, and we could keep track of their reproductive performance, so they would pregnancy scan together, but then managed separately and kept separate to the time of marking, gave us a chance to look into the performance and rearing of those maidens. So we had some small differences in the pregnancy rate, which is typical. We expect younger animals to have a lower fertility rate. We also expect a younger animal to have a lower kid survival rate as well. But the difference here was actually really quite stark. At 36% kid survival, it really had a big impact on the net reproduction rate on those farms. So it was quite clear that even when in well-managed farms, the maidens were a problem when nutrition becomes a challenge. Just a little aside, is one of my last slides. A little aside here is that oftentimes the bucks are either continuously exposed to the females or are just put back out there to see if you can rear a few extra kids, which has been a practice while the goat prices were quite high. And so we looked at that in one particular site where we had adult and maiden does that were either rearing kids with a wet udder or a dry udder, so not rearing kids in those age classes. And what we see is some pretty clear differences in the fertility and the scanning rates between those groups. So if you're exposing a buck to an adult female that's rearing a kid, then fertility is pretty low. And this is still in the drought, so some difficult seasonal conditions. If those females are not rearing kids, then the fertility is back up to about where we saw, which was typical for the rest of the study. If they were maidens, they were substantially lower pregnancy successes and scanning rates. So a maiden that was already rearing a kid had a very low fertility rate and a low scanning rate. So if you're just continually exposing the females, then there's reproductive wastage starting at the very beginning with failed to conceive. And that just points us towards a slightly better management system. So udders have stood out for me in my review of animals as I go around looking at different herds of goats. And I see a lot of variation in udders, and it's low-hanging fruit and can be quite easily tidied up. If we take alone from what we know in sheep, is that the majority of the losses, which is well close to 60%, is due to only about a quarter of the females that are breeding. When ewes have poorer quality udders, their lambs are 1.5 times more likely to die and 4.6 times more likely to die from starvation. So there's welfare issues associated with the breeding of females that already have bad udders. So if you're thinking about taking an action, I'd start by looking at the udders of the females before you continue to breed. Just a little shout out, it's my second last slide, a little shout out around a project, a genetics project that we're undertaking at Condobolin. The breeding starts next February. We have at least 5 matings where we plan to breed 8,000 kids from 1,000 does. We'll have an accelerated kidding program there. We've covered a number of different breeds, so there'll be pure breeding and crossbreeding in that, and it's a focus on genetics and data recording. So traits like growth rates and reproduction, worm egg counts are going to be measured there. That's an important project that you need to be aware of if you aren't. And this slide here is a tribute slide to a good friend of mine, Colin Ramsey. He's the guy that got me into goats, and that's a delightful photo I was able to take at his place, and I'm thinking of Colin at this time. Bridget, that is the end of my presentation. It's time to get the take-home messages from the producers.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for showing us some of the research around kid loss. I think the numbers are quite interesting, and we really appreciate your talk tonight. If there's any specific questions for Gordon, please put them in the Q&A, and we might have a look at those at the end of all the speakers. Thanks, Gordon. So our next speaker is James Boland. James is part of a partnership that runs a managed boar composite operation at Mount Hope in Western New South Wales. They're keen observers of legacy practices while being enthusiastic adopters of novel concepts and research that can help them improve animal welfare and productivity. James and his team believe that the reproductive capability of goats in a managed system is not fully understood, both in terms of what's possible and perhaps more importantly, how to get there. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. And hello, everybody, and welcome to the MLA Kid Loss webinar. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of our learnings on the topic of minimising kid loss. Just bear with me and I'll try to get... There we go. Technology's working. First of all, just a few comments about who we are, so we can set some context around the comments that I'll make in following slides about how we try to minimise kid loss and maximise weaners through the draft. We're in Western New South Wales. We started off playing around with wild harvested rangeland goats, and everybody likes pictures of goats. Oops. That's how we started, and that's what it looks like now. It's a little bit different. So there's about 800 of our primarily boar, but a boar composite does in the yards at Mount Hope. Back to the home slide, please. We've been investing in genetics. We buy our bucks in. We've been investing in infrastructure and on-farm research. Some of that research that Gordon referred to a moment ago has been done on our properties, and we're keen to continue down that path. As I said, or as Vanessa said, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot that we don't know, and we're fairly confident that the potential for this species is untapped. Many of our insights from our managed mobs will translate into semi-managed operations. Next slide, please. So our breeding context. I showed you the pictures of some does a moment ago, boar and Kalahari composite does and F1s. We've got just had our first crop of F2s hit the ground a couple of, about 6 weeks ago. So we've primarily those boar composite, and we do have some rangeland does that we put our boar and Kalahari bucks across, hence the F1s, but most of our does are that improved boar composite type. We run the does in mobs of about 800 to 900 head. The mob size is determined by how many kids we can comfortably mark in a day so that we can get the kids back on mum at the end of the day's work. And any more than 800 or 900 does gives us too many kids to manage. We'll aim for 3 joinings every 2 years. That's invariably going to drive some out of season joining, and we see our production metrics drop down. Our numbers certainly do take a hit when we know that we're joining at a time of year that goats wouldn't normally join, but to keep the ball rolling and to keep mobs staggered so that every couple of weeks there's another mob joining the production cycle, it's necessary to accept that. We try to get the weaners off at about 8 to 10 months of age, and we're targeting a carcass weight of 15 kilos. More pictures, please, Bridget. Next one then. Thank you. So those guys are about 8 to 10 months old. That's hopefully what a truckload of weaners is going to look like. And back, please, if you tap. And that's what we're trying to produce. They're about 15 kilos hot standard carcass weight, and hopefully a consistent carcass product. Thank you. So in minimising kid loss, what we're trying to do is maximise conception rate. And I noticed Gordon introduced the concept of fertility and fecundity and maintaining or supported pregnancies in a webinar about kid loss. And I'm going to speak to that as well. We want to maximise our conception rates and maximise our kid survival rates. And we think that the high water mark is yet to be determined. We thought we knew where the high water mark was as far as managed goat mobs in the rangelands and their productive metrics, but we exceeded all expectations in 21 after the drought broke. Yeah, we think the high water mark is even higher than people might think. Next slide, please. So to maximise our conception, we start with buck classing and joining ratio. We run all the bucks through the handler and make sure that we're only putting bucks that we think are in the best possible order out to the does. That buck classing is subjective only at this stage. We'll be keen to see what research and what objective information comes out of the condo research. We run our bucks at about 6%. We put them in for 42 days and then they come out and everything is done to the date. But it's a high joining ratio, the 42 days being 2 estrus cycles, of course. We class our does and cull fairly aggressively, and since we've been introduced to Gordon's research, we've started culling on udders as well. Management of our maidens, we hold our maidens back from joining the reproductive program until they're about 35 kilos live weight, probably just about to cut their 2 teeth. So 11 to 12 months of age before we're contemplating joining our maidens. When we do join our maidens, we join them in small paddocks. We join them with a high buck percentage, and we join them with supplemental feed available to hopefully try to get the maidens to aggregate to try to get over the concept of shy joiners. The body condition score of our does is very important to us, and that's backed up by Bordeaux's research. We try to hold our does probably no less than 2.5, but closer to a BCS of 3. We scan everything, and if something is scanned dry twice, it gets culled. If it's scanned dry once, it reverts back into a mob that might be 2 or 3 weeks behind it coming through the production system. Worm egg counts and parasite control, we're fortunate we don't have a great parasite burden out here in the rangelands, but when seasonal conditions are with us, we certainly do. And we have an active program of conducting WEC tests on all of our mobs and just trying to keep ahead of any worm burden. Our experience has been that once you end up with a wormy mob and you start to see, heaven forbid, losses because of parasite burdens, it's really, really hard to dig yourself out of that hole. So we've learnt to try to keep ahead of any looming or potential parasite burden. The availability of lick. We make lick available to our does. There's two particular products we put out. If you jump on that little icon there, we'll see what's in them. And so the lick sample to the left, the copper, selenium, and zinc, we would contend support fertility and reproductive prowess. And over on the right, that's a different lick product. I think the calcium and the phosphorus is what the goats are going for there. We've started measuring or recording how much of each lick block is going out into each paddock. And we're just about 12 months into that program. So now we will look forward to being able to marry up how much lick is being consumed by paddock, by numbers of goats and their stage of life or the reproductive cycle. So it'll be really interesting to see how much lick and which lick they're taking when they're lactating or when they're dry or if they're a wether weaner or a doe weaner. That data set has just come together, so it will be interesting to turn that into information. How much are our goats consuming? The adults are consuming about 1 kilo per head per annum, and the weaners are a lot less than 75% of the adult weight. The weaners are consuming about 750 grams of lick in total per animal per annum. So that gives you an idea of how much of the stuff's going out. Back, please. And I spoke about out of season joining. Unfortunately, there's no way around it, and we will have some mobs that will be joined when it wouldn't be a naturally convenient time for goats to be joined. But we accept that that's what's necessary if we're going to run a continuous joining program with 3 in 2 years. Next slide, please. Maximising kid survival. Paddock selection is key for us. And unfortunately, we've learnt that some paddocks just don't perform as well as other paddocks, and it could be a combination of the browse and graze or the cover that's available or where preferred stands of feed are in the proximity to water. We've got some paddocks that are our favourites, and we get our best kidding results in certain paddocks. So I'd commend that to any producers, that if you have poor results, try to correlate or try to interrogate what your paddock's offering your mob. And conversely, if you have good results, try to interrogate what's different in that paddock. Minimising predation, we have an active program to try to keep on top of predators as best we can via fencing, habitat removal, and where available for dogs, lethal means, ground and aerial baiting. The numbers that we would lose through predation aren't particularly high, but they certainly do add up. So we try to keep on top of that. Gordon made a comment or had a slide there about the body condition scores of does late in pregnancy affecting their ability to carry pregnancy. And we've certainly had experience with that, where we've seen the body condition scores start to taper off probably at about 4 weeks before kidding, which resulted in, or we think that's what resulted in an abortion storm. That abortion storm may have been caused by other factors, but we think it was probably body condition score. So we supervise our does all the time, and we're aggressive supplemental feeders, particularly in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, that we will start ensuring that the does are hopefully hitting a target BCS of around 3 in that last 6 weeks. We think if you leave it to 4 weeks before kidding, and you have the doe is nutritionally challenged, that's going to end in a bad result. We've got a summer embargo on kidding. It gets pretty hot out where we are, so we do not join between 3rd week of July and through to 3rd week of September, so that we don't have kids hitting the ground during the heat of summer, and also so that we don't have does that are lactating and kidding subject to heat stress themselves. Minimal stress handling. Hard to quantify if this affects our kid survival rates, but we try to minimise the duress on the does and the kids. Things that we use to do that: cooler paddocks, a series of laneways, so that we're not mustering and pushing and harassing and hunting kids, particularly when they're coming in for marking and going back out after they've been marked, that we can hopefully move them in a really gentle way. If you just tip them into a laneway and somebody can sit behind them in a side by side and listen to the cricket on the radio and just let them trickle along back to their paddock, bearing in mind the paddock might be 15 kilometres from the yards, and if the animals have just been through a husbandry process, well, we're trying to minimise as best we can the duress on those animals. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that we know that we don't know. Next slide, please. Some future initiatives and things that we would like to know more about and that we're going to hopefully start to experiment with. We started putting EID tags in everything this year, and we're keen to figure out if we can scan for multiples and then identify if a doe has been scanned wet with multiples, identify that against her unique identifier for a EID tag, to identify fecundity as a possible source of replacement does. We're keen to explore paddock scale initiation and synchronisation of estrus in an entire mob, bearing in mind that the mob's going to be 850 to 900 does, and they might be running in a 5,000 acre paddock, and a paddock could be 15 k's from the yard. So we can't necessarily adopt an AI program, but we're keen to explore a thought bubble about if there's something we could do on a paddock scale to influence the onset of estrus. And finally, in the next couple of days, we're going to be running a little on-farm how's it go trial of the benefits of using analgesics when marking buck kids with elastrator rings. So there'll be 2 mobs go through the yards, and we'll be putting those EID tags in them. We'll get weights on all of the boys, and some of them will be benefiting from an analgesic and others won't. And it'll be very interesting to see what the mismothering rates look like and if there's any difference in weight gain. I don't think the difference in weight gain would so much be a factor of how much milk they're consuming. I think the difference in weight gain will probably be a factor of those that have been mismothered because they've been unhappy about the husbandry process without the use of an analgesic. Next slide, please. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and hopefully there was something in it for you, and hopefully there's something in it for your goats.
Thanks for your talk, James. It's great to hear what you're trying to achieve and some of the management solutions you've implemented around kid loss. I'm sure it gives confidence to others to potentially adopt something similar. So thank you. We have had a couple of questions come in just from your talk. When you were talking about maximising conception, we had a question come in about what you consider a high buck percentage.
6%. 6%.
Thank you. And there was another question as well regarding the supplements that you put out. Do you use a loose lick or a lick block?
Lick blocks, both in lick blocks. Both of those products are blocks.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker is Craig Stewart. Craig, with his wife Jo, operate a mixed farming property at Collie, Central West New South Wales, with boar and bull cross goats being one of the major enterprises. Craig is a passionate advocate for the goat industry, with particular interest in R&D to improve overall performance of goats, especially in the area of kid wastage, with which they personally battle. So thanks, Craig. Over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Vanessa. Mel, Bridget, thanks for everyone. And I hope I don't let the side down. The previous 2 presenters have done a pretty good job, so we'll have a go. Righto, so a bit of an update or a catch up on what we are and where we are. Like, we're at Collie, actually, Vanessa, not Collie. It's Central West New South Wales, about 80 to 100 k's north of Dubbo. We're in about a 20-inch rainfall or a 500 mil rainfall. We're mixed farming, as she said. We've got a couple of paddocks of, you'd say, heavily timbered. We don't actually have any shrub country as you that you'd call scrub, like as we all know was ghost and scrub, like and the rest of our country is just open grazing or open farming paddocks with limited tree resource. So, and we're probably 75% self-mulching black country, the rest of it be red loam and a bit of red clay sort of country originally. So there, I'll just check my notes. Now, we were part of Gordon's Kid Loss project in 2019. We're currently part of Queensland University's Kids Plus trial as well. We've got a mob in that. So, and we spend a lot of time on this subject ourselves. And obviously, it's something that's got my attention. And if you're watching this or listening to it, it's got your attention too. So, if you can take one thing home from this webinar, I think you've done pretty well. If you take more than that, you've done really well. So, but there were definitely something to take home. Right, so due to the fact that we run the paddock to plate business and it's about consistent supply of product all year round. So that forces us into kitting 3 times a year at the moment. So our main kitting is that typical August, September kitting, which everyone knows it's the easy join, I suppose, that's the natural time they like to kid. So then we only kid each doe once a year. So we split our mobs up, our herd up into mobs and everything else. And we do have a few rangeland, or you'd call them rangeland cross does that we actually have got themselves on a cycle of 3 and 2 years. But the boars don't seem to have the ease of ability of doing it with the rangeland ones for some reason. Not that I try to push them either. So, yeah. So our additional kitting, they're smaller kittings, but they're in March. Then we do a May, June one, and this year we're actually going for a 4th kitting, which will be October, November. Now, partly due to the lower conception rates of our summer joining, we sort of find that we're getting lower percentages in those earlier kittings anyway. Your joinings aren't there, so your overall marking percentages aren't going to be there. Now, just while we're there, I'm not going to go and say mention percentages or talk about percentages so much. Like if you ask me what percentages, I'm not going to tell you, because this isn't about what I'm doing. It's about changing your percentage by doing some of this stuff that we think benefited. So you might be on 100% or you might be on 80%. It doesn't worry me. It's about improving where you are. So yeah, we'll talk about feeding and that sort of stuff, and you need to get advice from someone that can actually give you good advice on nutrition, and if you need it, if you don't need it, if you can't work it out for yourself. And there's plenty of people out there, whether they're private or company funded or whatever, you'll find someone that'll give you a helping hand on that side of the ledger. So with that, weather plays a massive part in what we do with our joinings, and our aim is to minimise the effects of the weather through paddock selection, nutrition, and shelter. Now I'm a bit slow here, sorry. So this is a picture we're all familiar with, and it's not a nice picture. So this is what we're dealing with. So I will say that we've done hundreds of autopsies in the last 4 years, both by us and by vets, to try and get our head around some of this stuff that's going on. So anyway, we'll move on and we'll talk about a few of the things we do. Now, shelter. Now, shelter doesn't have to be a shed. Okay, it can be as simple as a butter grass, or as this case here, where it's just a paddock with a few roly-polies and that sort of thing. Now, you say it's untidy and everything else, but it's actually quite beneficial. I'm not saying you have to be whole paddock like this, but and then it's making do with what you have, I suppose. So, which is what we're trying to do here. This is another one. She's that first one was actually a May kidding, so it was a midwinter kidding, and as you can see from these photos, this year's photos were not abundant with feed at the moment. So this one's just summer grass and a bit of roly-poly, and that's actually the September kidding this year. So, and in this case here, it's just simple as a bit of summer grass, like butts of summer grass. They can get down in and amongst it. Out of the wind, like wind's a big killer. Like Gordon touched on it, and he's saying about the chill factor. Like we all know, rain and wind together are pretty dangerous with goat kids. So it's that lets them get in there but out of the weather. And also, not so much this grass, but some of those roly-poly ones and some of the heavy timbered, and even in the case of the scrub, like if they can get in there, and it actually keeps them away from some of your flying predators as well. Like they sort of, the bigger ones seem to like a bit of a runway that's clear. So if you can hamper that runway, you probably can hamper them taking a few kids. Right now, I think everyone's familiar with this little fella. He's now I can confidently say that we don't have an issue with these at all. Now, why is that? It's because we're running a program, baiting program with about 20 neighbours, I suppose. It's something we've been doing for about 10 years, but we don't give up on it. We do it every year, regardless of whether you think you got foxes or not. So it's like we're to the stage this year, like we've got dead kids and the bodies are lying there for weeks afterwards. Like there's no predators to speak of that are taking them away like normal. So that's the 1080 program we run doing that. Then after that, we've got a few of these fellas, like your livestock guardian dogs. These are Maramas. We've only got 3 of them. We run them in 3 mobs over in our smaller place where we've got smaller paddocks. Like they're on look after about 150 to 200 does. Do they do the job? Yeah, I don't know. That's I don't go and camp with them, but there's nothing running around in the paddocks, and you see them chasing kangaroos and hares and that sort of stuff. So I'd assume they're doing their job with the foxes, and the other part of it is, if nothing else, they've got a scent around their boundaries, like that dog scent, like they're lifting their leg on posts and everything else. So it's the foxes can obviously smell they're in the vicinity. But then, look, crows are a bit of an issue, that they're a bit harder to control. They're only one of those 1%ers, sort of, maybe. They can be vicious at times. When you see them, the mob will fly in and circle a doe that's got twins or triplets on the ground, and they'll just draft one out, and that's the end of that kid. But yeah, it's not a big issue, and I suppose the same with the wedge tails. Like for us personally, they're not a big issue. For some people, I think the issue's bigger. It's something I can't help you with. Like I'm out of my field there with that one. So, but we do find that they are seasonal. Like they only turn up at a certain time of the year, which is probably a good thing. I think sometimes it's the main best season. So, body condition score is probably their thing, and this is a big key to trying to stay productive in what we're doing. The maidens we join at an age from 7 to 15 months. Now that's based on a live weight, and the condition score thing. Now we talk 3%. We talk the condition score of 3. Like I'm not scared to run them 3.5 or a bit better. It doesn't seem to be detrimental to their joining or their carrying the kids. Like it's easier to start at 3.5 than it is to start at 2.5 going forward from the year. Right, so this is a mob of mature does that they're just in their last week of kidding now. That this has taken the end of August. So our aim is to carry them through in that 3-score condition or better from the time they joined until after they're kidded. Now these are being supplemented at the moment, so I'll get onto that in a minute. It's one thing everyone talks about condition score, and everyone says, yes, we know about condition score, and oh yeah, that goat looks fat and that one looks skinny, but a lot of goats that you might think they're fat until you actually put your hand on them. And I think there's a lot of people we need to feel them. We need to put our hand on them, at least get a guide of where you are to start with. And you can't do that in the paddock. You got to get them in, put your hand on them, and you got to learn, feel it, and learn it, and and after a while you'll get a better handle on being able to judge them in the paddock because you've sort of looked at them, you felt them, and everything else. So it's a key thing. Like it's actually feel it, in my opinion, and I think Gordon had really vouched for that one as well. Like I know he's very on that nutrition and condition score, and actually been accurate in your condition scoring of animals. So the next thing we're going to talk about is which is how you keep that condition score of nutrition. Probably the number one key, I think, really in all of this. So like in what we do, we're very aware of the need to supplementary feed to fill the gaps for their need required. So it's about monitoring your nutrition, your feed requirements every day. Like it's and some people will say, how do you do that? And it's probably not something I can tell you how to do it. It's something you got to learn. And that's where you, same story, go and ask for help if you don't know how to monitor your feed you got on hand or how you stock it going. Get help. That's because there's people out there who are so just willing to help you get it right. So don't be scared of that. Paddock selection. Now James touched on this one too, and he's dead right when he says that you got good paddocks and you got bad paddocks. I don't know why it is either, but we've got paddocks that we just don't kid in anymore. No, it's a paddock selection for kidding. Shelter's one issue. Ample feed's another thing that you've got to have. Like you need enough feed so that day where the kids, for 2 days, that she doesn't have to step more than 5 feet away from those kids. So they actually learn to bond and carry on. Now, if she's got to go wander off for feed and everything else, you limit the chance of that bonding happening, which will add to your percentage of kid loss. So supplementary feeding, like it's one thing we do is sow a winter feed, like this is a drop of vetch that we've got here. They'll go in. This year, I think they went in about 8 weeks before they kidded one mob. As a rule, they'll probably go in 6 weeks prior to, depending on what the paddock history is like where they are. Ideally, you'll pick a fresh paddock and put them in worm free, that sort of stuff. But sometimes just things don't allow for you to always have a new paddock. So that's one way, and the other way we do is just supplementing with grain through lick feeders or trail feeding. That's one of those, just a lick feeder. Very, very efficient way to get nutrient in animals. Now you'll say it costs money, you say, to feed them grain and buy grain or whatever else, and I suppose my answer is it does, but remember we're talking about filling a gap. Now this gap might only be a 3-week gap, or it might be a 6-week gap or something like that. We're not talking about a full-on drought feeding regime. Like we might be talking about $10 worth of barley for that short period where they got the head in a lick feeder. So there is a difference between that and full-on feeding. Now I've always maintained you need to put in to get back. Like you can't run these animals lean and mean and expect them to give you 150%. Because I think most people have found out that doesn't work. I'm one of them, I'm totally guilty. So, so in that respect, I'd prefer 2 kids at $30 or $50 or whatever. They're not worth much at the moment. We all know that, but whether it's $30 or $50 you get for them, I prefer 2, not 1. So I'm willing to put in to aim for that 2. And so yeah, we are trail feeding a couple of mobs at the moment that are just finishing up kidding. We've been feeding them through the kidding. Now this year, you've got to remember this is supplementary feeding. These does haven't been hungry, I suppose. Like I just feel they need it. Like it always drags it out of them when they're kidding and got kids on for the first while, and but they've got enough feed where they'll still stay away. They'll see the feed cart come into the paddock, and if they're kidding, I had kids, they won't come in. So which is the problem if you're doing it when they are hungry. So it's always easier to do it before they get hungry. All right. So Gordon was talking about, and I think he's always talked about this one, and I'm sure he said it tonight, but he talks about the low-hanging fruit. So, as long as I remember Gordon, I'll remember that phrase. Now, in that case, he's talking about udders and bad udders and that sort of stuff. So, all right, so here we've got a photo of an old doe. Now, she shouldn't even be on the place. She should have gone last year at the latest. Like, we all have. You got to be really, really strict on it, I suppose. Otherwise, they will keep sneaking through. Like we actually class probably twice a year for our does. Like that's for that doe. Like we'll class them at kidding time. We'll wet and dry them, and then we'll pull out bad udders then. And you'll still miss some because they've probably got a kid on them. Even though they've got a bad udder, they might have one side working and the other side no good, things like that. So we'll actually endeavour to bring them back in at joining time, and we'll reclass and hope to clean them up that way. But we still get them. Like it's we've had maiden does that have blown out in the udders in the first kidding, so it's you can't get 100% on it. Here we have another case. Like here we've got an old girl with a very low slung udder and 2 kids, and I can tell you that they didn't get on, and in the real world they'd be dead. So yeah, it's low hanging udders are just detrimental as well. Like it's even though they look good and everything else, I suppose it's about learning what's going to end up as a low hanging udder when she's full term, when you're actually looking at her when she hasn't got a kid on her. So it's there's a bit of learning in that one too. Here we have, and it's probably very close to the perfect udder. It's high, it's got good teats, everything else. That's what you're targeting every day. You have to have something like that. Now, another thing we do is with teats and that sort of thing is at marking time, all the does go over the rail along with the bucks to be weathered, and they're all checked for teats. Now, you're not going to pick up every other fault around, of course, but you're going to pick up your bad teat faults and that sort of stuff. And when they're identified, they're just automatically tagged as a weather. So there's no confusion down the track. Like if it's tagged in the weather area, it's on the truck and gone. So we find that's a pretty good way of not having things like that happen. After observing getting those, and probably too many hours in my life, there's a few other things that we see, and there's probably I think it's far too high a percentage we have that where a doe might have twins or triplets or whatever, and she gets them all up. And in a lot of cases she'll feed them all, but you'll see her 5 days later, 6 days later, and she might only have one kid. And I haven't been able to put my hand on why it is. Like she seems to be, once she gets them up and walking, she just doesn't want to own a couple of them. Like you see them throw them over the shoulder and all sorts of things. And you might say that, oh yeah, they're not her kids, but from the time I've spent with them, I can guarantee you that they're her kids. But so yeah, there's a few other things like disease could be another thing that causes some of these problems. Brain damage, and I personally feel genetics has a big part in what's going on here, but that's for next time. Not on that one, but now the next thing that we try to avoid is stress. It comes in numerous forms. Handling stress is probably one, especially if you do a pre-kitting, vaccination, drench, that sort of stuff. That's can really trigger it off where you'll cause abortions, and which is the main thing from stress. As my good wife will say, keep it calm. That's she's never said a true word. So yeah, just when handling pregnant does, just keep it calm. No unnecessary whatever it is. So, and there's a few other forms of stress, and one's that lack of nutrition that'll cause nutritional stress, which will cause abortions, hand over fist, and adverse weather. Like you might get a cold change or something come through, and it can actually cause abortions too if you're not careful. So, now in 2019, when we were in that trial with Gordon, it was the middle of the roaring drought, and but none of us want to remember that time. We did a lot of disease testing on kids that were being aborted and born dead, and looking for explanations. And we actually found no diseases or anything like that was detrimental to the health. It's in the end, it was just I wasn't feeding them enough now. It's taken a fair bit to a bit that you think you're doing your best, and sometimes your best ain't good enough. We all live that at times, and hope we don't live it too soon. So we'll move on to this photo, which is we're just about there. This photo here. Now, to me, this is the ultimate goal of what we're aiming for. We've got a doe. She's got a good udder, and she's actually got 3 kids on her, and she's raised 3 kids. So that's what we're aiming for. Now, a couple of little take-home things I want to put here at the end is one is learn and act. Do the easy things first, and they might be 1 or 2 percenters, but they add up. If you've got 3 or 4 2 percenters, you're at 8%. So, and sometimes the 2 percenters are the easy things to rectify, sometimes they're not. And there's a bit of a cash cry getting around at the moment that says control the controllables. I think it's very apt. So to me, that says focus on what you can change, not what you can't change. So, and with that, that's me done. Thank you very much, and hope I haven't bored you and all that sort of stuff. So, well, back to you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Craig, for your presentation. I love the photos and particularly your information on nutrition and udders. I'm sure there's some practical solutions producers can come away with, so thank you. I do have some questions pop up in the question and answer box for you, Craig, so just keep your mic on for a minute. Has the maramas, or how have you managed maramas so that they don't go through the fence? And how have you designed the feeding stations for these dogs? Do you use non-meat dog pellets?
Yep, a couple of good questions. Keeping the dog in the paddock. That's been pretty easy until our last dog. We found the easiest way is put them out really young, put them out by themselves. And they sort of build a bond pretty quickly. Like we've had them in the paddock at 12 weeks old with does. It helps if the does a little bit familiar or something like that. It's probably one time where some of Joe's potties have been a bit beneficial that we can actually bond them with the potty and put the potty and the dog up with a mob of goats. But yeah, in the last one we've had a lot of trouble keeping him in his paddock, and we actually ended up putting a bit of polypipe across his collar. So whether you meant to do that to dogs, but it's actually kept him home. And in saying that, I think the reason he was actually getting out was he was actually chasing things and they'd go through the fence or over the fence, and he hadn't worked out that was the boundary. Because I do know people with maramas where they can wander from only 10 neighbours away if you don't keep on to them. So now the feeding one is it's an issue. We only feed them dog biscuits, and as I said earlier in the thing, we keep them here where we live, where we're close and small paddocks. So I just do a drive by on the bike of an afternoon or whatever and throw a handful of biscuits over them over the fence time. But we are working on an automated timer feeder at the moment that hopefully we'll get going. But yeah, we just use normal dog biscuits. You do have to be careful with RAM and all these sorts of things on that one. But yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Next question we've got is, what sort of grain are you using to supplement the does?
Just barley as a rule. We normally just keep X amount every year for ourselves, for our own use and that sort of stuff. If we got to buy grain, like we'll probably prefer to buy a higher protein legume, probably more so than the barley. Lupins are ideal, but you've got to be price sensitive, so you don't have any problems with grain poisoning or acidiosis or any of those things with lupins, which you do with anything with yeah, I can't think of the word. Any other grains that you carbs in them. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you mean high starch grains. So
yeah, that's the one.
Thanks, Craig. We've just got one last question for you, Craig. One of the producers has noticed there's a few full-length ear tags in your photos. What management or ID tags do you use?
Yeah, righto. So nearly all our animals now have some form of EID tag. We've been tagging 4 or 5 years now, I suppose. We've had a few issues on the way and that sort of thing, but that's our main thing. We do have some does at different lines that we want visual ID on, that we just run a middle-sized cattle tag with a number on it. We're still sort of, it's a hard one to how you go from a visual ID to a EID in some forms of what we're doing. So yeah. But all our current drops of kids are all EID'd at marking time. So we follow them through all their life.
Great, thank you. We've got a few pre-webinar questions that we asked people to put in of what they'd like to see in the webinar today. So I'll open up the questions to the rest of the panel as well. The first one we've got is soil and water sampling. Where can we get this done? No one has answered any inquiries that this person's has sent, so they've just not been able to get any soil or water sampling done before. Has anyone got experience with this, and can they help?
Come over here, Gordon.
Yeah, no problems. New South Wales DPI will do soil testing as well as water quality testing. So you just need to contact one of the officers in the state and get the sampling tubes. No problems at all.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, how did you take the guesswork out of what you have in terms of nutrients in your browse on your land versus what supplement that your goats will require year round? I guess, James, because you're probably putting out supplement, you could be best to answer this one.
Yeah, sure. Before I get to the answer, all of our paddocks have got browse and graze available to them, and we notice that sometimes the mob will move away from what looks like a beautiful stand of lucerne and they'll go into some rough native country, and then other times they'll descend on a stand of narrowleaf hotbush and decimate it, and then other times they'll be happy as clams in a stand of ryegrass. So we think, just from paddock observation, that the goats pretty much self-regulate what they need, and they go to different food sources when it's all on a platter in front of them. And to the question, how do we quantify what they need? Well, I guess the only answer for us is the body condition score. They've got the availability of the browse and the grows, and if we don't think that they're where we want them from a condition perspective, then we start supplemental feeding. We try not to trail feed or try not to interfere with them too much through kitting. And I was interested in the previous speaker's comments about that. We would use lick feeders and, as best we can, try to avoid interfering with them during the kitting period. What we put in the lick feeders, we've used a lot of wheat or all the cereal grains, wheat, oats, barley, and of course with the rider that you have to introduce them slowly, those high starch cereals, so you don't blow them up with acidosis. But we haven't been bitten on that front, that we have used wheat and barley extensively.
Thanks, James. The next question is, when a doe delivers kids prematurely, will she still produce colostrum? What are all the causes, factors making a doe abort delivered dead kids 1 to 3 months from the due date?
I think I'll take that one. It's a difficult question depending on when we're talking about prematurity. If a neonate's born about 10 days out from the expected due date, I'd expect problems with colostrum. So lactogenesis is the creation of new milk, so the udder starts to develop at around day 125. It takes about 3 weeks or so to fully prepare the udder and provide a milk yield and get the colostrum going. If you've got a neonate that's being aborted or being born more premature than 10 days, there's no chance. So it really depends on when we're really talking about the expected date of birth. And of course, the amount of milk that you produce will be a function of age. So maidens will have a smaller milk yield and a smaller udder. And also feed base, how much nutrition they've got, will be able to supply energy and protein to develop the udder and the milk. So there's a couple of factors there. So nutrition's important.
Thanks, Gordon. A question here is, how important is the kid-doe bond and maximising time at the kidding site and not disturbing them?
I reckon Craig might be able to answer this one. From sheep, it's a 6-hour period to get that solid bond in the sheep. And I'm guessing that it's the same in the goat. The amniotic fluid is repulsive all the time, except in the few hours after birth when it's an attractant. And so you get the licking process commencing from the time of birth, and the neonate's got to suckle milk to really form that solid bond and needs to continue to suckle milk. And so in the sheep, about 6 hours quietly together is important, which is why things like privacy and mob size have relationships, and how far the animals have to move for water and for feed all affect survival outcomes, and mostly due to the strength of the bond. Craig, you might have some comments on that too.
I think you've covered most of them, Gordon, but you're dead right. Like, it is very critical, and you see examples where you might have a doe's kid in the mob when they camp for a night, and they a lot of times end badly because of the traffic getting around them and everything else. So they don't like anything unusual. Now, I ride around my does a fair bit during kidding, but it starts probably 3 weeks before kidding. Like, I'm not an unusual sight to them. I don't run interference on anything. I'm there to observe, and I find it's the best way for me to learn, besides listening to Gordon on these trials, is to actually observe what's going on in your own mob. But it is one key issue, is that bonding.
Thanks, guys. Probably the final one for this evening. Are there any considerations for kidding within a confined feeding situation? Does anyone have experience or any comments in regards to that?
I'll have a bit of a go at it. I wouldn't recommend what my thoughts of confined is, depending what you call confined. If you're putting 500 does in 100 acres, I'd say, yeah, it's worth a chance. But yeah, it's a density thing that you don't want them kidding on top of each other, and that mismothering and confusion and everything happening that can. So it's I know they do lamb, sheep in confinement, but I'm not sure of the area per ewe or anything that's allowed. I don't know whether Gordon's got any uptake on what's going on there with the sheep stuff.
Look, it's really tricky. Kidding or lambing in confinement is going to be a problem. Most people don't have a terribly enjoyable time, and there's things we could consider to research in and around that, but at the moment there's no great recommendation. I know that in the last drought, people rested their lambing paddocks for the whole of the gestation period and had their females, had the ewes, and these are ewes in confinement, and by the time they were at the point of lambing, there'd been absolutely no pasture growth whatsoever. They still released them to give the animals space and just continue to feed them their feed-based requirement, the grain feeding in the external environment.
There was one case here during the drought, Gordon, with some sheep that they had in confinement, and they actually had to let them out because, and I'm not sure of the reason, but they were actually having a lot of prolapse ewes. And they're putting that down to being in confinement. I think it was lack of exercise, probably what they were blaming on it, but I'm not sure. So, yeah, I think it is fraught with danger.
Thanks for that, guys. So I just want to take the opportunity again to thank all of our speakers tonight. We appreciate the time it takes to put together the information presented, so thank you. We hope this information from the webinar has been useful and you've come away with some strategies to reduce kid loss. We would appreciate your feedback from today's session. You'll find a survey link that's just been shared in the chat box. So if you could please complete this quick survey to provide your feedback for all of those attending today's webinar. So thank you for your attendance as well. So that probably concludes everything that we've got for you tonight. We'll soon send you out a post-webinar email with the links to the various resources and a recording of tonight's session. You can find more goat-related information on the MLA website at mla.com.au/goatshub. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.